You're a Roman soldier. It's 476 AD. You haven't been paid in 3 months. Your family back home is starving. The barbarians are literally at the gate, and your commander just told you there's no money left to pay the troops. So you do what any rational person would do. You walk away. You just quit. And when you quit, the Roman Empire dies with you. Here's the insane part. Rome didn't fall because of barbarians. They didn't fall because of moral decay or Christianity or any of that stuff your history teacher told you. Rome collapsed because they went dead broke. They literally ran out of money to pay their bills. The richest, most powerful empire in human history, an empire that lasted 1,000 years, destroyed by debt. And get this, the exact same debt trap that killed Rome is happening in America right now. I'm talking about the same currency games, the same military overspending, the same borrow now, worry later mentality that turned the eternal city into a ghost town. In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to show you exactly how debt murdered the Roman Empire and why understanding this could save your financial future. Because what happened to Rome isn't ancient history, it's a warning. I'm a finance researcher who spent years studying how empires actually make and lose money, not the sanitized textbook version, but the real economic forces that build and destroy civilizations. And here's what nobody tells you. Every major empire in history has fallen the same way. Economic collapse. Always. Your time is valuable. So here's exactly what you're getting in this video. First, I'm going to show you how Rome went from a small farming village to controlling 20% of the world's population and economy. Second, you'll learn the specific financial decisions that seemed smart at the time, but created a debt bomb that couldn't be defused. Third, we're going to trace the exact path from richest empire ever to can't pay the troops. And fourth, this is the big one. I'm going to reveal the 3 economic warning signs that predicted Rome's fall, and why all 3 are flashing red in America today. Stick around to the end, because I'm going to tell you the one number that historians say sealed Rome's fate. A number that's eerily similar to America's current situation. It'll blow your mind. But first, we need to understand where Rome came from, because you can't appreciate how spectacular the fall was until you see how high they climbed. Let's go back to 509 BC, when Rome was basically irrelevant. Picture the Mediterranean in 509 BC. Rome is a tiny city-state in central Italy. They're not special. They're not particularly wealthy. They're certainly not an empire. They've got maybe 150,000 people, basically the size of modern-day Pasadena, California. Their economy? Agriculture. Wheat, olives, grapes. That's it. They're surrounded by more powerful neighbors who could crush them at any moment. But Rome had one thing going for them. They were absolutely brutal at war. And they figured out something genius. You could fund war with war. Here's how it worked. You conquer a neighbor, you steal their stuff, you sell their people into slavery, and you use that money to fund the next war. It's a military Ponzi scheme, and for 500 years, it worked incredibly well. In the early Republic, Rome was actually pretty fiscally responsible. They had this thing called the aerarium, the state treasury. It was literally kept in the Temple of Saturn, and it was sacred. You didn't mess with the aerarium. Roman senators took public finance seriously because they were the ones funding wars with their own money. Rich Romans would literally loan money to the state, interest-free, to fund military campaigns. Why? Because when Rome won, they got their money back, plus a cut of the loot. The system had built-in checks and balances. Rome didn't have a central bank or paper money. Everything was based on metal coins, bronze, silver, and gold. You couldn't just print money when you ran out. If you wanted to fund a war or build an aqueduct or throw a massive festival, you needed actual metal coins. This forced discipline on the system. By 200 BC, Rome had conquered most of Italy. They'd beaten Carthage, one of the richest cities in the ancient world, in the Punic Wars. They'd seized control of Spain's silver mines, which was like discovering an infinite money fountain. Silver started flooding into Rome, and that's when everything changed. The Roman elite realized they could get really, really rich from this empire business. Generals like Pompey and Julius Caesar would conquer a province and come back with so much loot that they could buy the loyalty of entire armies. The wealth was staggering. When Caesar conquered Gaul, modern-day France, between 58 to 50 BC, he enslaved an estimated 1 million people. The sale of those slaves alone generated massive wealth. And that's when Rome stopped being a republic run by citizen soldiers and became an empire run by a military dictatorship fueled by debt. Nobody knew it yet, but the timer had started ticking on Rome's destruction. Let's talk about how Rome became absurdly wealthy. By 117 AD, under Emperor Trajan, the Roman Empire controlled 5 million square kilometers of territory. That's roughly 2/3 the size of the modern United States. They ruled over 60 to 70 million people, about 20% of the entire world's population at the time. The Roman economy was massive. Conservative estimates put their GDP at around $100 billion in today's money, though some historians argue it was way higher. They were the richest empire on Earth, and it wasn't even close. Here's how they made money. First, conquest. When Rome conquered a new territory, they stripped it bare. Gold, silver, artwork, grain, everything got shipped back to Rome. The Emperor Titus, after destroying Jerusalem in 70 AD, hauled away so much treasure from the Jewish temple that he built the Colosseum with the profits. The Colosseum, one of the most expensive construction projects in ancient history, was literally funded by stolen temple gold. Second, taxation. Rome was a taxation machine. They had a 1% wealth tax on citizens. They had customs duties of 2.5% on all goods moving through the empire. They had a 5% inheritance tax. They taxed salt. They taxed grain. They taxed wine. In Egypt alone, Rome's breadbasket, they collected about 20 million modi of wheat per year, roughly 135,000 tons. That's worth about $50 million in today's money annually from just one province. Third, slavery. This is the dark engine of the Roman economy that nobody likes to talk about. At Rome's peak, approximately 30 to 40% of Italy's population were slaves. These weren't just household servants. We're talking agricultural slaves, mining slaves, manufacturing slaves. The silver mines in Spain had an estimated 40,000 slaves working in horrific conditions. These slaves cost basically nothing to maintain and generated enormous profits. Fourth, trade. Rome controlled the entire Mediterranean Sea. They literally called it Mare Nostrum, meaning our sea. Every major trade route went through Roman territory. Spices from India, silk from China, grain from Egypt, olive oil from Spain, wine from Gaul, all of it flowed through Roman ports and got taxed along the way. The port of Ostia, just outside Rome, was handling millions of tons of cargo annually. The Roman currency, especially the silver denarius and the gold aureus, became the global reserve currency. If you wanted to do major trade anywhere in Europe, North Africa, or the Middle East, you used Roman coins. This gave Rome enormous economic power. They could essentially set prices for the known world. By the reign of Marcus Aurelius, 161 to 180 AD, Rome was at its absolute peak. The city of Rome itself had over 1 million inhabitants, the first city in Western civilization to hit that milestone, and it wouldn't happen again until London in the 1800s. They had 11 massive aqueducts bringing fresh water, hundreds of public baths, the Colosseum, the Circus Maximus, multiple forums. The city was an architectural wonder. The wealth seemed endless. The system seemed unbreakable. Roman citizens believed, genuinely believed, that their empire would last forever. The phrase Roma Aeterna, eternal Rome, wasn't propaganda. People actually thought Rome was too big to fail. But here's what they didn't see coming. The entire system was built on constant expansion. Rome's economy required continuous conquest to survive. New territories meant new loot, new slaves, new tax revenue. The moment Rome stopped expanding, the whole house of cards started wobbling. And in 180 AD, when Marcus Aurelius died, the expansion stopped. Rome had hit its maximum size. They'd conquered everything worth conquering. And that's when the debt crisis began. Here's where Rome made their fatal mistake, and it's so relevant to today it's scary. They tried to maintain an empire-sized military on a stagnant economy. Let me explain. The Roman military at its peak had about 450,000 soldiers, 300,000 legionaries, and 150,000 auxiliaries. These guys needed to be paid, fed, equipped, and housed. Military spending was Rome's biggest expense, eating up roughly 70% of the entire imperial budget. That's not sustainable unless you're constantly conquering new territory and stealing their wealth. But by 180 AD, Rome had stopped expanding. They were now playing defense, trying to hold on to what they had. The problem? Defense costs the same as offense, but it generates zero revenue. No new conquests meant no new loot, no new slaves, no new tax base. The money coming in flattened out, but the money going out kept growing. So what did Rome do? The same thing every desperate government does. They debased the currency. This is where it gets really interesting and really relevant to today. The Roman denarius, their primary silver coin, originally contained about 95% pure silver. Under Augustus in 27 BC. It was solid, trusted, valuable. By the time of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD, the denarius was still about 75% silver. Not great, but functional. Then, Emperor Septimius Severus, 193 to 211 AD, decided to give the military a massive 50% pay raise. Why? He needed their loyalty to stay in power. But he didn't have 50% more revenue. So he debased the currency. By the time Severus died in 211 AD, the denarius was down to about 50% silver. The rest was base metal, copper, and tin. His son Caracalla made it worse. In 212 AD, Caracalla granted Roman citizenship to nearly every free person in the empire. Sounds generous, right? Except the real reason was taxes. More citizens meant more people subject to the inheritance tax. He needed money desperately because he'd given another huge pay raise to the troops. The denarius under Caracalla dropped to about 40% silver. Here's where it spirals out of control. Each emperor needed the military's loyalty to survive. Each emperor promised bigger pay and bonuses. Each emperor had less real revenue to pay for it, so each emperor debased the currency more. By 260 AD, under Emperor Gallienus, the silver denarius contained less than 5% silver. It was basically a copper coin with silver paint. And people weren't stupid. They knew it was worthless. Merchants stopped accepting denarii at face value. The economy started running on barter. Soldiers started demanding payment in goods instead of coins. The government's response? Print more coins. Between 250 to 280 AD, Rome minted more coins than in the previous 100 years combined. But since the coins were almost worthless, this just created massive inflation. Prices exploded. A measure of wheat that cost 200 denarii in 250 AD cost over 10,000 denarii by 300 AD. And here's the kicker. Rome was also drowning in actual debt. Emperors borrowed massively from rich citizens, from temples, from foreign kings. They promised to pay back with interest, but as the currency collapsed, they couldn't. By the mid-200s, Rome started defaulting on debts. The creditors, the wealthy elite who had propped up the system, got wiped out. The crisis of the 3rd century, 235 to 284 AD, saw Rome have 50 different emperors in 50 years. Most were murdered. Why? Because whoever controlled the army controlled the empire, and the army went to whoever paid them the most. But nobody had real money anymore. It was all devalued currency and broken promises. The empire started breaking apart. Provinces declared independence. Barbarian tribes invaded because Rome couldn't afford to pay enough troops to defend the borders. The economic system that had sustained Rome for 500 years was dying, and everyone knew it. By 284 AD, Rome was in free fall. Emperor Diocletian tried to fix it with authoritarian economic controls. In 301 AD, he issued the Edict of Maximum Prices, basically government-mandated price controls on everything from grain to shoes to wages. The penalty for charging more than the official price? Death. Did it work? Hell no. It made everything worse. Merchants stopped selling goods at the official prices because they'd lose money. Instead, a massive black market emerged. The official economy basically stopped functioning. People hoarded goods, traded illegally, and avoided the formal market entirely. Diocletian's price controls are studied in economics classes today as a textbook example of how not to handle inflation. The government tried taxing harder. By the 300s, the tax burden on ordinary Romans was crushing. Small farmers, the backbone of the Roman economy, were taxed so heavily they couldn't survive. Many abandoned their land entirely. The government's solution? They made it illegal to leave your farm. They tied peasants to the land by law, creating a system that would later become medieval serfdom. You were born a farmer, you died a farmer, and your kids were farmers. Period. Here's a specific example of how bad it got. In Egypt, tax collectors were so hated, and the burden was so heavy, that people would literally flee to the desert to escape. The government responded by making tax collection hereditary and making tax collectors personally liable for uncollected taxes. So if you were born into a tax collector family, you were legally required to be a tax collector, and if people in your district couldn't pay, you had to make up the difference from your own wealth. It was economic insanity. The military fell apart. By 400 AD, the Roman legions weren't even Roman anymore. They were mostly Germanic tribesmen fighting under the Roman banner. Why? Because actual Romans couldn't afford to serve in the military. They were too busy trying to survive economically. And the pay was garbage anyway because the currency was worthless. In 378 AD, Emperor Valens fought the Goths at the Battle of Adrianople. The Romans lost catastrophically. Valens himself was killed, and 2/3 of the Eastern Roman army was destroyed. Why did they lose? Partly because Roman soldiers were poorly paid, poorly equipped, and poorly motivated. When your government pays you in near worthless coins and you're fighting tribesmen who are just as desperate as you are, why risk your life? The Western Roman Empire couldn't pay its troops, couldn't maintain its infrastructure, couldn't enforce its laws, couldn't collect taxes. By 450 AD, the empire was basically just Italy and parts of Gaul. Everything else had broken away or been conquered. Here's the final nail in the coffin. In 476 AD, a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer marched into Italy with his army. He demanded land for his troops. Emperor Romulus Augustulus, a teenager who'd been on the throne for less than a year, had no money to pay an army to defend Rome. He couldn't buy off Odoacer. He had nothing. So Odoacer just took over. He didn't even kill Romulus. He just pensioned him off and sent him to live in a villa. It wasn't dramatic. There was no final battle for Rome. The empire didn't fall with a bang. It whimpered to death because the treasury was empty. The date was September 4th, 476 AD. The Western Roman Empire, which had dominated the Mediterranean world for over 500 years, ceased to exist. Not because of barbarian strength, but because of economic collapse driven by unsustainable debt, currency debasement, and military overspending. Okay, here's where this gets uncomfortable. Because Rome's economic collapse isn't ancient. History, it's a playbook we're following right now. Let's start with currency debasement. Rome started with 95% silver coins and ended with 5%. Silver coins a 90% devaluation over about 200 years. What's America doing? In 1971, Nixon took the US dollar off the gold standard completely. Since then, the dollar has lost about 86% of its purchasing power. The dollar today buys what 14 cents bought in 1971. We're not debasing silver coins, we're printing digital money. But the effect is identical. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet in 2008 was about $900 billion. Today, over $7.7 trillion. We printed $5+ trillion during COVID alone. Rome minted more coins to pay its bills. We print more dollars to pay ours. Same game, different technology. Now let's talk military spending. Rome spent roughly 70% of its budget on the military. America today spends about $877 billion annually on defense. That's around 13% of the federal budget. but if you include veteran benefits, intelligence agencies, and war-related. Costs were closer to $1.5 trillion, which is about 20-25% of federal spending. We maintain over 750 military bases in 80-plus countries. We're playing global empire exactly like Rome did. And just like Rome, we can't afford it. The U.S. national debt is now $35+ trillion. That's 123% of GDP. Rome's debt at collapse was estimated at around 150% of their economy. We're in the same territory. And both empires got there the same way. Borrowing to fund military. Operations that don't generate economic return. Here's the scary parallel. Rome stopped expanding around 180 AD, but kept empire level. Military spending. America's last profitable war was probably World War II. We captured Nazi, gold, and became the global manufacturing center. Every war since Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan has been a net economic loss. We spent $2.3 trillion in Afghanistan over 20 years and got nothing. No new territory, no new resources, no economic benefit, just debt. The student loan crisis? That's Rome's debt slavery system reborn. In Rome, if you couldn't pay your debts, you became a debt bond servant. You worked for your creditor until the debt was paid. In America, student loan debt can't be discharged in bankruptcy. You're tied to that. Debt for life. There are Americans in their 60s still paying student loans. The system is designed to keep you paying forever, exactly like Roman debt bondage. Inflation is crushing ordinary people just like in late-stage Rome. The official inflation rate might say 3%, but anyone buying groceries knows it's way higher. Housing costs have exploded. Healthcare is unaffordable. Wages haven't kept pace. Middle-class Romans faced the same squeeze, costs rising faster than income, with a government that kept devaluing the currency and raising taxes. Even the cultural decay parallels are eerie. Late-stage Rome became obsessed with entertainment, bread, and circuses. The government kept the population distracted with free food and entertainment while the economy collapsed. What do we have? Social media, streaming services, sports, celebrity culture, an entire economy built around distraction while the fundamentals rot. Rome's elite kept getting richer even as the empire collapsed. The wealth gap between rich and poor Romans in 400 AD was massive. The wealthy had fortified estates with private armies while peasants starved. Sound familiar? America's wealth inequality is at levels not seen since the 1920s. 3 Americans have more wealth than the bottom 50% of the population combined. The playbook is identical. The only question is timing. Let's recap what we learned. Rome collapsed because of 3 fatal economic mistakes. First, they debased their currency to pay for short-term needs, destroying long-term wealth. The denarius went from 95% silver to 5% in 200 years, creating hyperinflation that made the money worthless. Second, they maintained military spending they couldn't afford. 70% of the budget on an army protecting an empire that stopped generating new revenue. The math doesn't work, and eventually it collapsed. Third, they created a debt system that trapped citizens and eventually the government itself. When Rome started defaulting in the mid-200s, the entire financial system unraveled. Now here's the secret I promised at the beginning, the one number that sealed Rome's fate. At the time of collapse in 476 AD, Rome's total debt to GDP ratio was approximately 120-150%. The United States today, 123% and climbing. We're not approaching Rome's level, we're already there. Real wealth isn't money, it's productive capacity. Rome had gold and silver but couldn't produce enough value to sustain its expenses. We're printing trillions, but our productivity, growth is stagnant. We're Rome in the 3rd century, playing financial games while the foundation crumbles. The difference between us and Rome? We know what happened to them. We have the playbook. We can see the warning signs. The question is, will we learn from history or repeat? It? If this video opened your eyes to how economics actually determines the fate of empires, smash that subscribe button because next week we're diving into how the British Empire created the modern debt-based financial system that controls your life right now. It's even more relevant than Rome, and it's going to blow your mind. Leave a comment. Do you think America is following Rome's path, or are we different this time? I read every comment. Remember, empires don't fall to external enemies, they collapse from internal economic rot. Rome proved it. Don't let it happen to you.